you'll notice that someone actually took a dollar bill, and this is not just someone who did this. There's actually, as I'll show you in the next slide, a tool available for people who want to stamp God out of America's consciousness. And instead of God, where it says, "In God we trust," you might notice that someone in red ink after crossing God out, wrote in red ink in capital letters above it, "In reason we trust." Now, we don't trust in God, we trust in human reason. And as a matter of fact, as I noted, this set of tools here will allow you to take the tool on the upper left side there and take a coin, and where God is mentioned, you can actually make that go away. And you can certainly get rid of, you can just put a stamp over God and get rid of God. Why would anyone think that this is reasonable? In a book called The Case for Atheism, a man by the name of George H. Smith made the following bold claim. "It's not my purpose to convert people to atheism," he wrote. "Such efforts are usually futile. It is my purpose, however, to demonstrate that the belief in God is irrational to the point of absurdity, and that this irrationality, when manifested in specific religions such as Christianity, is extremely harmful," he claims. It's extremely harmful to society for you and for me and for anyone to believe that there is a God. In other words, he says, "I have attempted to remove the veneer of intellectual and moral respectability that often enshrouds the notion of a God." Now, if a person wishes to continue believing in a God, that is his prerogative, but he can no longer excuse his belief in the name of reason and moral necessity. So essentially, the bottom line of all this is, if you believe in God, you are an ignoramus. You simply don't have any intellectual properties. You may have a veneer of it, but you're not really an intellectual person. I want to ask whether this man was uneducated and irrational. So I have no idea who he is. He is Aaron Wesley Dykus, or A.W. Dykus. And he was born May the 30th of 1888 in Festus, Missouri. And he moved to Indiana. He was married there and baptized in the same year of 1908. And he started out as a teacher in a one-room schoolhouse, but then he quit teaching to become an inventor, and he actually is credited with inventing the automobile turn signal in the year 1920. Was he uneducated and irrational? As you look at his resume, he began preaching full-time in Bloomington, Indiana, but he was not just a preacher, although that's a wonderful thing to be. He pursued an education, and money problems caused him to drop out and then try again, and so he never gave up. He finally earned a BS degree, an MA degree, and then ultimately a PhD in science and in the realm of physics. And as a matter of fact, in 1929, he would become the head of the physics department at the Tennessee Polytechnic in Cookeville, Tennessee. And he would then, in the 1940s, actually train graduates in nuclear studies to prepare them to work at the Oak Ridge National Laboratory. He was hardly a dummy. He was very educated and a brilliant teacher. And as you consider his wife's death, he then remarried a woman named Flora in 1953, and she encouraged him to start writing songs, spiritual songs. He had a knack for music, and she said, "You ought to write some songs." And he ended up writing about 3 dozen of them. But he's best known for one in particular that you and I sing and have sung for years, since I can remember being a boy. It was in 1966 that Time magazine came up with this cover, "Is God Dead?" That was April of 1966. Now, what does A.W. Dicus have to do with that? It was in that same year that that magazine cover came out that A.W. Dicus wrote the song, "Our God, He is alive. There is, beyond the azure blue, a God." And that is what he wrote. And I've loved that song for years, and as a matter of fact, I know that you could quote it by heart, so many of the verses. And it didn't strike me until years later. I may have been the last one to notice it. But it didn't strike me until years later that it's almost as if he had a copy of the book of Daniel open as he was writing that song. I can't prove that to you because I have any absolute facts or testimony from him regarding it. There may be something like that available that I haven't come across, but it's just the content of the book of Daniel compared to the content of his lyrics that makes one think that maybe this is the very book he was using as the basis for his writing. There was a long, long time ago a God whose voice, notice, the prophets heard. So he's got the prophets definitely on his mind. He is the God that we should know, who speaks from his inspired word. If you'll go with me to the book of Daniel, I want you to notice something that Daniel affirmed in Daniel chapter 2 and verse number 28. In Daniel chapter 2 and verse number 28, as Daniel is talking to Nebuchadnezzar, you will observe that there in Daniel 2:28, this is the statement made by the prophet. But there is a God. There is a God. There is a God in heaven that reveals secrets and makes known to the king Nebuchadnezzar what shall be in the latter days. So Daniel came right out and affirmed one of the lines that this song affirms over and over again. There is a God, He is alive. And then notice another part of the song that goes on to say that He's not only a God whose voice the prophets heard, but He is alive. And notice this next line, in Him we what? We live and we survive. When you study the book of Daniel, the first thing that comes to mind is that these men, Daniel and Hananiah and Mishael and Azariah, which were their Israelite names, were not uneducated men. As a matter of fact, I want to direct your attention to Daniel chapter 1 and observe that they were brought to Babylon in part because of their intellectual excellence. They were not uninformed. In Daniel 1, you'll note there in verse number 3, the king spake unto Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, that he should bring certain of the children of Israel and of the king's seed and of the princes. Now watch the description in verse 4. Children in whom was no blemish, but well favored, and skillful in all wisdom, and cunning in knowledge, and understanding science, and such as had ability in them to stand in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the learning and the tongue of the Chaldeans. Look at verse 6. Now among these skillful men who were cunning in knowledge and understood science, among these were the children of Judah, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, unto whom the prince of the eunuchs gave Babylonian names. Daniel became known as Belteshazzar. Hananiah became known as Shadrach. Mishael became known as Meshach, and Azariah became known as Abednego. And if you look at verse 17 of Daniel 1, you'll see this reiterated. As for these 4 children, Daniel 1:17, God gave them knowledge and skill in all learning and wisdom. So the idea that followers of God have to be some kind of ignorant, uneducated country bumpkins that don't know how to come in from the rain is certainly not indicated in this account. These followers of God were brilliant, and that's one reason Babylon wanted them in their area to serve, because of their academic excellence. Now, of course, there is beyond the azure blue a God, is what the song writes. And as we've already noted, it beautifully harmonizes with the statement Daniel makes in Daniel 2:28, but there is a God in heaven. There is a God in heaven. Now, as you think about this next statement, concealed from human sight. No man has seen God at any time, we're told in Scripture. God has provided glimpses of himself at times to men like Moses. And certainly in the person of Jesus Christ, God in the flesh, we see what God is like. But you'll notice that what the atheist cannot see sometimes is because he's not really looking at the evidence. I remember hearing about the 2 farmers that for some reason were in a fuss with each other about which one of them had the most rats in their individual barns. And one of them said, I guarantee you I got more rats in my barn than you've got in yours. No, you don't. He said, well, you come to my barn and I'll show you. And they went and made all kind of commotion and poked at all kinds of things, and rats were scurrying everywhere. He said, all right, okay, you've got a lot, but you come to my barn and I'll show you I've got even more than that. And they made all kinds of commotion and poked at things and prodded at things, and when he came, rats were scurrying everywhere. And when he came around the corner to say, see, look at all these rats, the man was standing there like this, said, I don't see a single one. I haven't seen even one of. And now this is the way sometimes people are with God. They don't see him, not because he's not there, but because they've closed their eyes to the evidence of God. Now, you and I have been in this building so many times. Even if we'd never been in it until today, this day, none of us would walk into this building and look around and see the structure and design and say, you know what, I'm persuaded this just happened by accident. I don't think anyone was involved in the planning of it. I don't think that screen's there on purpose. I think it just happened to land there. And fortunately, the thing pointing at that screen, casting the image on it, just happened to land there. None of us would ever go for that or buy that. We know that's not rational. What's Hebrews 3:4 say? Every house is what? Built by some man. Well, who would deny that? But he that built all things is God. The atheist can't see that even though the house he lives in and no house that he's ever been to could come about without God, he doesn't want to see it. Years ago when I was still preaching at South Haven, one of the elders and I went to St. Louis to catch a ball game so he could root for the Cardinals and I could root for the Dodgers. And during the daytime, we needed something to do, so we went to the St. Louis Science Center. I love true science. Tish has been a science teacher at times over the years. And so true science, yes, absolutely. And you can see from Daniel 1, God's not opposed to true science. These men, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, were skillful and understood science and knowledge. But in this particular St. Louis Science Center, there were all kinds of promotions of evolution as the means whereby we got here, and that was their explanation. We came around a corner, and there was a big blank wall. And that's all it had on it, was like maybe 9 video monitors mounted side by side, all very small in size. But if you look at the left-hand monitor and follow the progression all the way to the right-hand monitor on the far side, this is what you saw. First monitor showed them clearing the land. There was film taken of them knocking down the trees and paving over the dirt that had been smoothed out and putting the parking lot there. And then you see them building the Science Center itself. Finally, you get to the last video monitor, it's ribbon cutting ceremony. They basically documented how that house came to be built. I've never left graffiti anywhere, but I wanted to that day. There was enough space above those monitors and underneath it to put something like this. For every house is builded by some man, but he that built all things is God. Now, we don't have a video of God doing it. He spoke it into existence. It didn't take a long period of time. The only reason it took him 6 days is because he needed to create a time frame for us to live our lives. And of course, he ceased his creative activity on that 7th day. And so we have a 7-day week for which there is no scientific explanation, by the way. We can explain why a year is 365 days, but what's the scientific reason why a week is only 7 days? Who came up with that? What scientific principle dictates 7 days makes a week? There's no science that says that. God said that. God is the one who decided there'd be 7 days in a week, and the atheist cannot see certain things. And of course, men have never seen a universe come into existence by itself without someone bringing it into existence. And so there is then what you and I can see. I can look at my physical body and know that within my body and yours, there are miles, literally miles and miles of circulatory system, all wrapped up just so neatly and in place, miles of circulatory system in my body. The eyes that I'm blessed to possess are more sophisticated than the latest camera that any phone can brag about. And no one would believe that these phones came about just as a result of accidental chance and happenstance. But the eye next to it is even more powerful and sophisticated than this, and yet this had to have a designer, but this didn't. Come on. We know better than that, or we should. We should be able to see that. Stephen Hawking used to have a show on television, and at least one of his versions of that show had the intro end with the camera zooming in on his eyeball. And I thought to myself, what an appropriate testimony that is to the existence of God. Notice with me Proverbs chapter 20 and verse number 12. Proverbs chapter 20 and verse number 12. What does the Bible affirm about the hearing ear and the seeing eye? The Lord has made even both of them. The hearing ear and the seeing eye. And I've always thought it fascinating that no one would believe an artificial heart had no designer. No one would believe that an artificial heart just came eventually into existence with no human involvement or, intelligent mind behind its coming into existence. No one would believe the artificial heart did, but the actual heart, they claim that's how it got here? No. There is a God and He is alive. In Him we live and we survive. He tinted skies with heavenly hue and framed the worlds with His great might. Would you look at Daniel chapter 2 and verse 23? Daniel 2 and verse 23. This is Daniel talking to God, and he says, I thank Thee and praise Thee, O Thou God of my fathers, who has given me wisdom and might, and has made known unto me now what we desired of Thee, for Thou hast now made known unto us the king's matter. And so here we see Daniel reckoning and bringing recognition to the fact that God had indeed brought him into this knowledge. Whatever Daniel knew, he knew from God. God has sent a billboard every day for the world to see that says, here I am, I exist. David noted that in Psalm 19. He said, the heavens declare the glory of God, And the firmament does what? It shows us his handiwork. Now, Abraham Lincoln was not an inspired writer, but he did write something that is beautifully written. I can see how it might be possible for a man to look down upon the earth and be an atheist, meaning the conduct of people on earth might lead someone to think that. But I cannot conceive how he could look up into the heavens and say, there is no God. When you and I walk outside on a starry, starry night, and the moon's so bright, and it's hard to believe how far away those stars are that we're looking at, and how massive they are. One of the things I enjoy very much about going to the Creation Museum or something like that is the planetarium, where you actually kind of recline and look at how massive the outer space is. There has to be someone very majestic and powerful to create all of that, and there is a God in heaven, Daniel 2:28, and indeed, he is alive. I'm not the accidental happenstance of ocean slime that turned into this, that turned into something resembling man and ultimately man. No, I'm a member of the human race, made in the image of God, Genesis 1:26, and it's the fool who said in his heart the opposite of Daniel 2:28. Daniel 2:28, there is a God. Psalm 14:1, the fool has said in his heart, there is no God. Well, explain to us how this all got here. Dr. Duane Gish wrote a book called Evolution, The Fossils Say No. And this is what he wrote in that book. He said, the concept of a frog being turned into a prince in an instant is a fairy tale. But the assertion that a frog, given 300 million years, can turn into a man, now that's considered science. And isn't it sad to think that some people have been duped into believing that that's the origin of life? No, as Brother Dicus wrote in his song, secure is life from mortal mind. God holds the germ within his hand. Though men may search, they cannot find. For notice, for God alone does understand. As you think about life and you see the scientists are trying to duplicate it, and if they ever accomplish anything that resembles what looks like the creation of life, it's only going to prove one thing. Intelligent mind had to be behind it, right? It does not prove that therefore things can randomly come into existence on their own without an intelligent mind being behind it. And Brother Dicus understood that the secret of life is indeed separate from mortal mind's ability to understand. God alone understands. Job had a 70 rapid fire question quiz, I might say, with God, when God says, Job, how did I do this? I don't know. Where were you when I told the oceans you don't go any further than that? Job, explain that to me. Explain to me how all of these things happened. And Job has no answers because God alone does understand those matters related to creation. Now, the wisest men of Babylon did not and could not understand a number of things that they were asked to understand. Would you go with me to Daniel 2, and let me show you what spotlights their ignorance. Second year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. He's dreamed dreams, and his spirit's troubled. He can't sleep because he's trying to figure out what this means. So he says, get me the magicians, verse 2, and the astrologers, the sorcerers, the Chaldeans. I want them to show me what the meaning of my dream is. So they came, they stood before the king, and the king says in verse 3, I've dreamed a dream, and my spirit was troubled to know the dream, to understand the dream, he's saying. Then spoke the Chaldeans to the king in Syriac, O king, live forever. If you'll just tell us the dream, we'll tell you the interpretation. The king said, not so fast. He said, I don't even remember all the details of it. The thing is gone from me, verse 5. Now, if you have such special knowledge that you claim to have, you should be able to tell me not only what I dreamed, but what it means. So the thing is gone. If you won't make known to me the dream and the interpretation, you'll be cut in pieces. I'm going to turn your houses into the landfill. It'll be a dunghill for everyone to come and bring their trash and waste. But if you show me the dream and the interpretation thereof, I'll give you gifts and rewards and great honor. Therefore, show me the dream and the interpretation thereof. And they answered again and said, just let the king tell his servants the dream, and we will show the interpretation of it. It's a lot easier if you have someone tell you the dream. That way you can make up anything as to what it means. But if you don't even know the dream, you might come up with something and say, no, I know that's not what I dreamed. I may not remember every detail, but I know that's not what I dreamed. So he said in verse number 8, I know of a certainty that you would gain the time because you see the thing is gone from me. Quit stalling. If you will not make known to me the dream, there's one decree for you. You've prepared lying and corrupt words to speak before me till the time be changed. Therefore, tell me the dream. I'll know you can show me the interpretation. Watch verse 10. There's not a man upon the earth that could show the king's matter. Therefore, there is no king, lord, nor ruler that asks such things. No one's ever asked anyone to do what you're asking us to do. It's a rare thing, verse 11, that the king's requiring. There's none other that can show it before the king except the gods, and they don't live inside of flesh. So, for this cause, the king's actions, he's angry, he's very furious. Now, don't miss the connection between what he commands and how that's going to impact Daniel and Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. There in Daniel 2, note verse number 12. For this cause the king was angry and very furious and commanded to destroy how many? All the wise men of Babylon. Whom would that include? Daniel and those three companions were considered to be some of the wise men. So the decree went forth that the wise men should be slain. Verse 13 says they were looking for Daniel and his fellows. Why? They wanted to kill them. And then Daniel answered with counsel and wisdom. Notice the difference. He told Arioch, the captain of the king's guard, that had gone forth to slay all the wise men of Babylon. He said, what has brought on such a hasty decree from the king? And Arioch told him all about it. And Daniel went in and said, King, could I please have some of your time? I'll show you the interpretation. Verse 17, Daniel went down to his house. He told Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah about what was going on and asked them to please, will you please desire the mercies of the God of heaven concerning this secret, that Daniel and his fellows should not perish with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. And then it happened, verse 19, then was the secret revealed unto Daniel in a night vision, and God was the one who provided it, and Daniel blessed the God of heaven. Blessed be the name of God forever and ever, for wisdom and might are his. He, verse 22, reveals the deep and secret things, not science. He knows what is in the darkness. The light dwells with him. And he's thanking God and praising him for all that he's made known to him. And then verse 24, Daniel went into Arioch, and he basically said, don't destroy the wise men of Babylon. Just get me before the king. I'll show him the interpretation. And Arioch brings Daniel in before the king in haste. The lives are on the line. He said, I found a man. He's one of the slaves, the captives of Judah. He's going to make known to you the interpretation. The king said, are you able to make known unto me the dream which I've seen and the interpretation thereof? Daniel, are you able to make known? Daniel's going to give proper credit. He said, the secret which the king has demanded, verse 27, cannot the wise men, the astrologers, the magicians, the soothsayers, no one can show that to you except there is a God in heaven that reveals secrets and makes known to the king what shall be in the latter days. Your dream, the visions of your head upon your bed are these. And then he went through and told him exactly what he'd seen in the dream, and then he told him what it meant. That's Daniel 2. The wisest men of Babylon could not understand. If you put them up against the other intellects of the day, people would have said, oh, they're the wisest men, but they couldn't do what they were being asked to do. So that brings us to Daniel 4 for another instance of this. Nebuchadnezzar, we're told in verses 1 through 3, is sending this message out. It's like an open letter to the population from Nebuchadnezzar. We sign our names at the end of our letters. They would often begin their letters with who it is that was writing. We would usually wait till the end to put our names, but they would start off with who was writing the letter. Nebuchadnezzar, the king. Now, who's it addressed to? All people, nations, languages that dwell in the whole earth. Peace be multiplied unto you. I thought it good to show the signs and wonders that the high God has wrought toward me. How great are his signs, how mighty are his wonders. His kingdom's an everlasting kingdom, his dominions from generation to generation. May I ask you how Nebuchadnezzar knows any of that? God has told him through Daniel. And Nebuchadnezzar's buying it because, after all, none of his wise men could tell him the dream and the interpretation. Daniel could. So whatever God gave you the ability to do that, that's the God I want to know more about. He said, I was at rest in mine house and flourishing in my palace. I saw a dream that made me afraid. The thoughts upon my bed, visions of my head troubled me. So I made a decree to bring in all the wise men of Babylon that they might make known to me the interpretation of the dream. And here they came, magicians, astrologers, Chaldeans, soothsayers. I told the dream before them. They did not make known to me the interpretation thereof. Would you notice the next line? Verse 8, but at the last Daniel came. So the one who could tell him what God was really trying to show Nebuchadnezzar in that dream finally showed up. When you get to Daniel chapter 5, you have a different king. Daniel's lifespan in ministry spanned a long time. You've got a different king in Daniel 5, but he's got an issue. Verse 5 of Daniel 5. How would you like to see this? Fingers of a man's hand suddenly appear and start writing over against the candlestick upon the plaster of the wall, and the king could see the part of the hand that wrote. This caused his countenance to change. His thoughts troubled him. His knees are knocking. They smote one against another. He is very urgent. Get me the astrologers. I need the astrologers, the Chaldeans, the soothsayers. And the king spoke and said to the wise men of Babylon, who can ever read this writing and show me the interpretation thereof will be clothed with scarlet, have a chain of gold put about his neck. You'll be third ruler in the kingdom. They all came in, took a turn at it. They could not read the writing nor make known to the king the interpretation. So he is extremely agitated about this. And the queen says, don't let your thoughts trouble you. Look at verse 11. You know there is a man in thy kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. And in the days of your father, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, was found in him. And so, verse 13, then was Daniel brought in before the king. Are you that Daniel, the very one which are the children of the captivity of Judah, whom the king my father brought out of Judah? Yes. I've heard of you, that the spirit of the gods is in thee, and that light and understanding, excellent wisdom's found in thee. And he goes on to tell him how his wise men couldn't do what he wanted them to do. And Daniel reassures him in verse number 18, O king, the Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar your father a kingdom, majesty, glory, and honor. And he talks about what happened to Nebuchadnezzar, but then Daniel gives all the credit to God and interprets the dream, or the vision rather, in this case, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. Sometimes the interpretation is not what one wants to know. Verse 26, Mene, God's numbered your kingdom, it's finished. Tekel, thou art weighed in the balances and found wanting. Peres, thy kingdom's divided, it's given to the Medes and the Persians. You got to give Belshazzar credit, even though the news isn't good. He rewards Daniel for at least telling him the truth. And that very night, Belshazzar was slain. And you see these occasions again and again and again throughout the book. And that brings us to this phrase that we sing in that song all the time. For God alone does understand. For God alone does understand. And all of those passages on the screen are the ones we just read, showing that when human wisdom couldn't provide the answers, divine wisdom could and did. Now, what's the application for you and me? We're not waiting for someone to come and tell us the inspired interpretation of a dream. But when human wisdom fails us in how to live our lives and doesn't answer our questions, do you and I have a resource that is a divine answer to man's questions? It is, and it is still where men need to go to today. And then as we close out the last few minutes, notice this phrase, in him we live and we survive. As you read the book of Daniel, you see this phrase from that song on display multiple times. It starts in chapter 1. Remember that verse 8 says, Daniel purposed in his heart he wouldn't defile himself with the portion of the king's meat. He refused to eat those things that would have been in violation of God's divine law. And the prince of the eunuchs tried to explain to Daniel. He says, look, I don't think you understand. You're endangering my head to the king. I'm going to lose my head if you all don't eat this. And then Daniel said to Melzar, the prince of the eunuchs, who had been set over Daniel, and Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, he said, let's do a test, just 10-day test. 10 days, I beseech thee, let them give us beans to eat, pulse, and water to drink, and then let our countenances be looked upon before thee, and the countenance of the children that eat of the portion of the king's meat or food, and as you see, deal with your servants. He actually agreed to this deal and proved them 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, you remember what happened, right? Daniel and Hananiah and Mishael and Azariah, their countenances appeared fairer and fatter in flesh. They looked healthier than all the children which did eat the portion of the king's meat. And so here, in him we live and we survive. That is how they were able to survive. In fact, in verse 20 it says, in all matters of wisdom and understanding that the king inquired of them, he found not just their appearance to be better than the people, he found their interpretations 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers that were in all his realm. In him we live and we survive. And then here's your next example. Could Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah survive the fiery furnace? You remember that Nebuchadnezzar had commanded everyone to do what? To an image of him that was, incidentally, that image was about 90 feet tall. 90 feet tall. What had Nebuchadnezzar required of all residents? Bow. Well, what does the law of Moses say to those who want to follow God's 10 commandments under the law of Moses? First one, thou shalt have no other gods before me. Second, thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image. Don't bow yourself down to them. Don't bow to graven images. So Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, or sometimes we know them better by their Babylonian slave names. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are brought before the king to give an answer as to why they won't fall down and worship. Verse 6 of Daniel 3, whoever does not fall down and worship shall the same hour be cast into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. So you'll notice that when they're called to give an answer for why they won't bow, verse 16, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego answered and said, O Nebuchadnezzar, we're not careful to answer thee. In other words, we have no need to answer thee in this matter. If it be so, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us. Another song we sing that I haven't sung in a long time. Do y'all know that song? He is able to deliver thee. He is able to deliver thee. That's true physically. It's certainly true spiritually. Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, can you survive the fiery furnace? Verse 19, Nebuchadnezzar is so full of fury, his countenance has changed. I mean, he looks angry. He is angry. And so he says, heat the furnace 7 times hotter than you would normally heat it. And he commanded the most mighty men in his army. So these aren't people who don't know what they're doing. They tie Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego so they can't escape, and they cast them into the burning fiery furnace, and they're getting ready to just enjoy what's going to happen to them when we learn that the fire was so hot it slew the men that took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So when they first get thrown into the fiery furnace, they fall down. But they're bound. So how are you going to be able to? Next thing you know, Nebuchadnezzar is astonished because look at verse 24. He said, didn't we cast 3 men bound into the midst of the fire? That's right. True. That's true, King. Lo, I see 4 men loose, walking in the midst of the fire, and they have no hurt. The form of the 4th is like the Son of God. Nebuchadnezzar got near to the mouth of the burning fiery furnace, and he says, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come forth and come here. Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came forth, and the princes, the governors, the captains, the king's counselors gathered together, saw these men upon whose bodies the fire had no power. There wasn't even a hair of their head that was singed. They didn't smell like smoke. I used to go to the bowling alley on my day off when I was single and lived in Etowah, Tennessee, and you could bowl all day for $5. And so I loved bowling, and I'd go, but they allowed smoking there, and when I left, I'd think, why do I smell like, oh, I know why I smell like smoke. Can you imagine? That's just being at a bowling alley distant from where the smokers were. It still got on me. These guys were thrown into the midst of a fire. It didn't even smell like they'd been in a fire. In him we live and we survive. And the last example is Daniel, and I'll just show you this. You know the story, no need to go back through it. Daniel, as an aged man, was cast into the den of lions because he wouldn't stop praying to God. He violated the decree. And yet you remember, this is a beautiful way to end this study. There in Daniel chapter 6, the king says, O Daniel, is thy God, whom thou servest continually, able to deliver thee from the lions? And Daniel's answer comes back, O king, live forever. My God has sent his angels to shut the lion's mouth. They haven't hurt me. And the king's exceeding glad. I wish we had time for this. The last part of the song, There is a God, He is alive, has our God who sung upon a tree, a life was willing there to give. That's Daniel 9:24 and following. The cross of Christ is interpreted as definitely the fulfillment of Daniel 9:24. And so this song, maybe next time we sing it, we'll be able to remember back, even as we sing some of the words, some of these events that happened in the book of Daniel and how they apply to us today. Thank you all.